Hey folks, welcome to The Artist's Craft. I am your host Stacey Cochran, and we have an outstanding guest with us in studio today. After 25 years in newspapers, Suzy Barile now teaches English and journalism at Wake Tech Community College in Raleigh. She is a journalism graduate of UNC Chapel Hill and earned a master's degree in education from NC State. Undaunted Heart, the true story of a Southern Belle and a Yankee General, is her first book. She is also co-editor of the papers of Richard Caswell for the North Carolina Office of Archives and History. Thank you very much for joining us in studio today.
Hey, you're welcome.
So give us the 90-second synopsis. What is the story about in Undaunted Heart?
Well, it's the story of the daughter of the president of UNC who fell in love with the Yankee general whose troops occupied the town at the end of the Civil War. They got married and everybody was appalled. They moved away. There were accusations of they had stolen silver and jewelry when they left. And so Undaunted Heart is the rest of the story, so to speak. It starts out telling the beginning of how they met and all, but then it's the story of their life together.
And now you have a personal connection to this story.
I do. Ella Swain and General Smith Atkins are my great-great-grandparents. And I felt sort of like I wanted to tell the rest of the story because I didn't think that they had stolen jewels and silver and fled to the north. Back in those days, young women went with their husbands because young women didn't work, and he was from Illinois, so they moved to Illinois. So
it was part of the purpose to set the record straight?
Yes.
Tell us some of your earliest memories. How did you first hear the story of Ella and Smith Atkins?
Well, I always grew up hearing the story. My grandmother had her wedding ring, and it was promised to my sister because my sister carries the name Eleanor, which is Ella's given name. And I had also heard the story of how she'd married this Yankee general, and then I had heard the story about how her mother had refused to sit at the dinner table with him. And so you have those little stories. But it wasn't until 1992, after my mother died, that I found some letters that Ella had written to her parents, and it told about their life together, hers and her husband's life together. And then I knew that it was time to go do something about setting that record straight, because now I knew what it was like.
Take us back to that moment you found these letters. I'm sure viewers in our audience have maybe had similar kinds of revelations of family history or something like that. What were you doing when you found the letters, and then what went through your mind when you found these letters that were 150 almost years old?
I wish it were slightly romantic. My sister, who lived with my mother, had been cleaning out boxes after my mother died, and I was the executor to the estate, and so she would bring boxes of stuff to me. And so another box of stuff had some photographs in it in this old folder, so when I opened it up and I started reading the letters, I thought, oh my gosh. And at first I wasn't quite clear who they were from because I grew up calling her Ellie Swain. But everything she wrote was signed Ella, so I really had to make certain that that's who it was. And indeed, it was Ella writing to her parents. And I was just amazed at what her day-to-day life was like and the sadnesses that she went through. And then as I started researching it, it all became so clear how difficult life was back then.
What was the year? When did you discover the letters? Do you remember?
1992 is when I discovered the letters. There's 15 of her letters written between fall of 1865 and December of 1868.
Now you, in 2001, won a Paul Green Multimedia Award from the North Carolina Society of Historians for your presentation of the governor's daughter and the Yankee General.
Right.
So I'm curious how that presentation and writing presentation, and then of course the award, factored into your decision to write the book.
Well, what I first did was write a couple of newspaper stories because I was working at a newspaper at the time that used the letters to show what their life was like together. And then I was trying to get the idea out there, trying to find somebody who was interested in hearing about this, and I wound up doing a presentation at the Chapel Hill Historical Society for which I had to prepare a speech. So once I gave that speech, other groups started calling and asking me to come. So for about 15 years I was going around giving my presentation about it, and the manuscript for the book evolved from the manuscript of my speech.
Interesting. Now, so how did the letters So you found those in '92. The presentation that you won an award for was in 2001, so we're talking about 9 years there. Did it just kind of simmer on the back burner for a while?
It did for a while. I got married during that time, and I went back to graduate school at that time. So I actually used the letters. I'm sure my instructors grew very weary of reading about Ella and the General, but I used the letters to write a lot of different papers for my classes. I wrote one called The Rhetoric of Love. I did another on the education of women back in the late 1860s and used her and her daughter and her daughter's daughter. So I did a little bit with that, and I did a couple of the newspaper stories.
Now, what kinds of differences between what you had heard about her and the General from childhood, from young adulthood, did you find between the actual character as you started doing research and digging in and using a journalist's eye to figure out who was this woman?
Well, what was interesting to me was, you know, she married a Yankee general. Okay, well, why would she even do something like that? I mean, was it for shock value or just what? And my research showed that she had strong women in her own background who influenced her. And so the fact that she was able to do something like that was part of her character, that she felt like she could do anything. Both her grandmothers had lived through difficult times of raising children without husbands, and had to take care of themselves. Her mother had been the wife of a university president for 30 years, and that in itself was a difficult task sometimes because she was under the watchful eye of everybody, watching every move. And so what I learned about Ella was, through my research, it was these influences of these people who made her the kind of woman that she was. But then what she wanted to be most of all was a good wife and mother. And so she took this drastic step in marrying this man, but then really she just wanted to do the best that she could.
How important was historical accuracy in researching and then ultimately writing Undaunted Heart?
Well, for me, it was what I had to do. As a journalist, I had a difficult time thinking about fictionalizing it because the journalist in me wanted to give the facts and nothing but the facts. And I had a creative writing instructor tell me one time that I either was going to have to write it as fiction or I was going to have to write it as nonfiction, but he didn't think that I could intersperse the two. So I tried to set it up as a story. When I first did my presentation, it was chronological in the beginning and the end, but I tried to make it like a story so that people would really understand and empathize with the couple. So it made it easy when it was time to write the book to do the same.
Have you considered writing, you know, kind of a Charles Frazier-esque version of this story?
Wow. I guess that probably, if it ever becomes a movie, and I hope it will one day, that'll be left up to a scriptwriter who can do that. The publisher she would email me and say, you need more description, because I was used to that. Facts, here's the facts, here's the facts, and not doing a lot of description. So I had to push myself to do the description in the book. I don't know whether I could do that for a script, or even for I don't want to say, fluffy's not the right word, for a far more descriptive piece.
Right. Well, one of the things that stands out to me as the strength of the book is, you know, there's not a passage written that there isn't evidence to support it, and the meticulous research that went into this, it really forms the foundation of a story about our community, and a story about your family, and a story about the recovery of Chapel Hill in North Carolina after the Civil War. But it would make for an interesting fictionalized version too, I suppose. So how did your training as a journalist inform the way you went about researching and writing Undaunted Heart?
I guess I had the background and the knowledge of how to get the information I wanted, and it was simply the doing of it. So I knew how to go about asking questions and making inquiries for information I needed, but the piecing together of all the puzzle pieces, in the packet of 15 letters were also a few letters that her mother had written to a friend, a letter that a cousin had written to her mother, and then some letters that her aunts had written to her and her sister and to her brother. And so those all helped tell the story of what life was like for them as well. The book is all research, is all done with primary sources, with secondary backups when I found other information. But what's out there on the internet today, between the time I began and today, is astounding. I found so much on the internet that I didn't even have to leave my home for, and that's a lot different than it was back in the days before we had it and doing research.
One of the things that strikes me about this is considering how much the story means to you personally. This is, you know, it reflects who you are. This is your family history, and you've got to, I'm sure, have discovered something about yourself in researching this. But in researching something that's so personal to you, how did you remain objective? And do you think you were successful at doing that?
I think I was objective. In my presentation that I made, I think that there was a lot more of me in it, simply because I was standing up there making the presentation. And so I could make aside remarks from time to time. A lot of these side remarks that would have been in the book came out and had to be replaced with statements that were more descriptive in order to give the feel of what was happening.
Well, the author is Suzy Barile. We're talking about her book, Undaunted Heart. It's a story, if you're interested in the local history here in Central North Carolina, it's a story that really reflects that really well. So check it out, Undaunted Heart, Suzy Barile. So my next question is, well, we were talking a little bit about the differences between historical fiction. My wife's she's a huge fan of Tudor England and reading historical fiction set in that time. So for you, what's the difference between what you've written in Undaunted Heart and something a little bit more fluffy, or something that kind of bends the rules or uses poetic license to some degree?
Well, for me, there was no poetic license, which meant that anytime there was a piece of information that I had to document it. So when you read the description in the very beginning of the book of what Chapel Hill was like on that Easter Monday, what was blooming in Chapel Hill at that time, I needed to make certain that I had the right trees flowering and the right flowers in the yards. When we describe what the area was like, I needed to make sure that that's exactly what it was like. When the soldiers and their horses and all their supplies line the streets, what is it that they're lining? You know, what does that street look like? So knowing that what the Swain's house looked like was important in me being able to describe it.
What are some of the major lessons that you learned about North Carolina in the years following the Civil War? What were some of the major lessons you learned about this state in the years following?
People were unforgiving, and sometimes they still are. I think we're still fighting the Civil War in this state sometimes. Not that that's bad, but that's been very interesting to me, the reception sometimes from people who the moment they hear that a Southern girl married a Yankee general, they don't want to know anything else. They automatically go, huh, well, and don't want to talk about it. So that was interesting to me to discover that how close the story is to people, even if they don't know Ella and the general, how close the story is to them because of their strong feelings.
Sure. Similarly, how did David Swain as a leader respond to the Civil War and its effect on UNC, Chapel Hill, and North Carolina?
Well, David Swain was not a secessionist in the beginning. He only finally agreed that secession was the way to go when there was no other choice. And likewise, it was his feeling that once the war was over, feelings had to be put aside, this country had to be mended, and how do we go about doing that? Unfortunately, not everybody agreed, but he also felt strongly about the importance of the state of North Carolina and education. He used his own money to finance keeping the university open during the war when there wasn't enough money to go around. And so North Carolina was an important state to him. He knew its history, he knew the people, and he loved his state.
Now, how do your ancestral ties to this state color your values today?
Well, I didn't really think of myself as a North Carolinian until I finished going to college. In my senior year in college, my dad was in the Navy. We moved around a lot, but I followed family tradition and went to St. Mary's in Raleigh for 2 years, and then transferred over to Carolina and got in. And so after being here for that length of time, I decided that I wanted to make North Carolina my home instead of going back to Northern Virginia where my family was, or to Florida where my mother had come from. And so I started learning about the history. I thank Bill Powell in my book, because had I not taken his history classes my last 2 semesters of college and really learned about the state, I think I would have been at a loss when it came time to write this book.
So knowing your family history here, knowing that, how do you view North Carolina? I mean that's what I'm trying to get at is, you know, you have such strong family ties to the region. Do you think about it differently than somebody who, you know, moves here from New Jersey and has no, you know, ties to the state, do you think?
I feel like it's mine. I feel like I have to do what I can to support North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And when I go places and talk about North Carolina, I try to be knowledgeable about it. One thing that I've always done as I traveled was to always learn about where I was going. And so I do tend to try to learn as much as I can about the different places in the state so I can speak knowledgeably about it. If somebody's going to criticize something that's happening in the western part of the state, I at least want to be able to be knowledgeable enough to be able to speak up about it. So I guess I have made it my job since I was in college and finished to know about the state of North Carolina.
So what does North Carolina mean to you?
Gosh, what does it mean to me?
That's a big question.
I know. I'm a Tar Heel.
What is North Carolina, and how is it different than other states, other regions?
It's green. We have lots of trees here. That's what all my friends tell me when I travel around the country. I'm in a professional organization. I've gotten to travel a lot once a year to different parts of the country. We have great writers in this state, and if you go to other states and look in their bookstores, North Carolina's writers are on their bookshelves. I think that we have I think that the influx of new people over the past 25 years has been good for the state, but it's also diluted it a little bit in terms of people not knowing as much about it when they move here. One of the things I've always tried to do is to teach people about it. Like, until Cary got so big, a newcomer to Cary would get one of my tours of, this hospital wasn't here 25 years ago. This was a little crossroads right here. So it feels like it's mine to a certain degree. I hope maybe that's what you're looking for, is that it feels like it belongs to me. North Carolina is a part of me.
And that makes perfect sense. No, I wasn't looking for any specific answer. I was just looking, I guess, for what your thoughts on what North Carolina means to you.
The history of the state is so important. How we got to where we are is so important. As a journalist, I worked for the Cary News and covered the town of Morrisville. I covered the airport authority. I covered the Wake County Commissioners, and I watched the evolution of how all that was happening. And so knowing how it all comes together is important to me, especially for people who don't know it, because then I'm able to share it. So you move to the state and it's not exactly what it is. There's more to it than what you're seeing when you move here.
Do you think of it as a southern state?
Very much a southern state. I think that we're trying to keep it a southern state while we're moving into all the technology that we have that makes us a part of the bigger United States and a part of the bigger world. But I think we are a southern state, and all you have to do is drive outside of the Raleigh city limits or the Cary town limits and look at the tobacco barns that are still out there, or drive some of the back roads of the state and see that we're still farming. We're still doing some of the things that we've done all along. It's just not on as grand a scale.
So if you were in charge of planning for Raleigh, Wake County, and the Piedmont of North Carolina, where would you invest your energies?
Gosh. Oh wow, we can't bring back tobacco. It's not good for us anymore. The grape industry is doing wonderfully, and there's a little bit of a growing mushroom industry in the state. And I think I'd look at what agricultural crops we could continue to grow and try to put an emphasis on that, because we have some people who don't want to work in high tech. I think that I would put an emphasis on making sure that the students are educated and that they have a variety of different fields to go into. And I think that we're doing all of that, but it's difficult in these times. But I don't think that we want to lose a sense of what our history is and what we came from. I think that that would be a shame.
When you're reflecting, you know, when you're having your morning tea, do you ever imagine, do you have a vision for what North Carolina should look like?
Gosh, when I'm having my morning cup of tea, I'm looking out into my yard, which is full of trees, and thinking how wonderful it is. And I was telling you earlier, we're renovating a house in Iredell County to move to later this summer, and there's a lot of trees there, and I sit on that porch and I look out, but then I go into Charlotte and I hit some of that traffic. And I think for North Carolina, we really need that balance of the two. We need a place where people can go and get away and enjoy themselves and get away from the hecticness, but we need to have the cities because that's where the plans are being made and the ideas are germinating and where a lot of the work has to be done. I think if we can find a balance on that, where maybe people can feel that going to a part of the state they've never been to before, when they're on vacation would be a way for them to get to know the state. So I see us keeping our countryside but having to rely on our cities.
Maybe an investment in our parks and recreation is it's a practical thing
and that's the way it's been. I mean, you know, people lived out in the country and they went to town and they did their banking in town, they did their shopping in town, and then they went back home again. So we need our cities for our football teams and our basketball teams and for our high-tech industry, but we need to be able to also go back to nature, so to speak.
Well, the author is Suzy Barile. She is the author of Undone at Heart. We're talking a little bit about it and about what North Carolina means to her and to myself as well, I suppose. So what advice, I'm sure you've come across people now that you've got a book who want to know more about their family history. What advice would you give to folks who want to know more about their family history? Where do you even begin?
Well, one of the assignments I do for my literature students, because I teach early American literature, so we do from Columbus all the way up through the start of the Civil War, is I direct them to Ancestry.com or some database like that. I ask them to do a family tree for one side of their family, just going back father, grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, or mother, and go back that way, because I think that most, if they have been in the United States or families in the United States for quite a while, that they probably have a Civil War soldier or a patriot in their family line. And so I direct them to one of those databases because it's just a wealth of information that we've never had available. But I also tell them, look in family Bibles. I was extremely lucky that I had Ella and the General's Family Bible, I had the Swain Family Bible, and I had the Atkins Family Bible, and they kept prolific notes. Who was born when and where and what time, and who died when and where. And so look in your family Bibles, and look on your family bookshelves if you've got any of your family's artifacts, and see whether there are any hints to what they are. Look closely at the photographs. The photograph of Ella that's in the book, when we finally looked at it closely, I discovered that she's wearing an earring and the locket that we still have. But it took a close look at that photograph. Nobody had ever really looked at it like that before. So paying attention to that will give hints as well.
Now here's a question. As a journalist, I'm interested in your take on the role of the journalist and how it's changed. So in 2010, what is the role of the journalist in our society?
I would hope that the role of the journalist is to continue telling the public what is happening without giving opinion when the news is being given. Listeners and viewers and readers have a difficult time discerning when they're getting fact and when they're getting opinion. And if you tune into a radio news show, you don't know lots of times whether you're in the middle of the news or in the middle of an analysis, and that's difficult to do. By the same token, we've come to a point where journalists are being asked their opinions as well. And poor Helen Thomas, you might have seen this week, tendered her resignation at the age of 89 when she spoke out and spoke her mind on something, and then realized that perhaps that wasn't the role as a journalist reporting the facts that she should have done. It's a fine line right now. And I think that somehow we're going to have to redefine it again for what the role of journalist is.
Well, you turn on the news and most of the time you hear nothing but opinions, you know, and that kind of Walter Cronkite journalism that I think people came to expect. It just seems like it's lost on the current generation.
Yeah, you've got to get the first 5 minutes of a newscast, or you're going to not get it. You've got to know when to take the bantering back and forth between TV newscasters as the fact, and when they're just chit-chatting. It is very difficult to discern all that, and you know, we almost need a course in how to read the news, how to hear the news.
So do you watch comedy shows like Jon Stewart or Stephen Colbert? What's your take on sort of the satire of, you know, pun blowhards?
Yeah. I've talked about that with my daughter, who is in her late 20s and is a fan of those shows, and we've talked about that before, because what she says to me is, Mom, if you listen carefully, they are telling you the news. You are finding out what's going on. You're just you've got to separate what's the fact of it from what their satirization of it is. But in terms of keeping up with what's going on in the world, it's given to you, and it's left up to you to delve more deeply into it. And so I think that we're putting more onus on the viewer or the listener or the reader than simply spoon feeding it. I think that for years and years we did spoon feed it, and we can't do that anymore.
So what's the future? What is the role of the journalist going to look like 10 years from now, maybe 20 years from now?
Oh, wow.
In our society.
You know, I don't know if any of us can say that, because if we had known, we certainly would have done a better job of keeping newspapers in business. I would like journalists to continue to be respected, to have the differentiation made between who's the news reporter giving the news and who the commentator is giving the commentary, and not have the mix. I want a finer line, and I think that journalists, in order to stay credible, are going to have to draw that fine line, because if you can't be credible, then who's going to believe what you tell, whether it's the fact or whether it's your opinion?
I just wonder if that's what audiences want.
I'm not so sure audiences know what they want. I think people are so busy these days that they're just willing to take anything. Like, I was driving back last night from Iredell County, and I was trying to find something to listen to on the radio. I just wanted somebody to give me something that would keep me occupied. It didn't really matter what it was. But I knew what I didn't want as I was changing channels, but I just wanted something that was going to soothe me, and I think lots of times people are just looking to be soothed. They don't necessarily want to know the hardcore fact of that traffic accident. They just want enough to know the road is blocked, you can't get through, and I'll worry about the rest of it later. So I don't know that I think that we want a little bit of coddling, and that's what we're getting right now.
Got about 1 minute left, a little under a minute. So what's next? 30 seconds, I'm being told. What's next for you, and what are you currently working on?
I'm promoting the book. I'm getting ready to write some articles about it, because it needs to have a little bit longer shelf life than just a year. And then with a co-editor, we're collecting the papers of Governor Richard Caswell to put them into a book. So working on that as well.
So you'll be looking for a publisher for that sometime?
Well, the state publishes that, so we're doing it for the state.
So you've got a home for it then. Great. Well, the author is Suzy Barile. We're just about out of time today. The book is Undaunted Heart. I would encourage you to check it out, learn a little bit more about your community and the history here, and a little bit of romance as well. Well, Suzy, thank you very much for joining us in studio today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And for all of us here at the Raleigh Television Network, the crew working hard in the back, Michael and Marnie, and the folks over at Master Control, thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you. And that's a show.
Good.
It flies right up.